Architects. Thank you, Angie, for starting that recording. We are one of the collaborators that's pulling together this mobilization and change effort. And as with the first session, I am joined by two amazing people who are going to be leading the majority of today's conversation. Paul Bachnight, an urbanist and architectural designer who currently works with the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and the Center for Transformative Urban Design. And Tabatha Montgomery, Executive Director of the Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association, who also leads Reach Twin Cities, a central information hub for updates, resources, and opportunities around community recovery, renewal, and wellness that was created to support impacted communities following the murder of George Floyd. It is great to see so many familiar faces from our first session on Tuesday night. Welcome to you and to anyone who is joining us for the first time today. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask that we introduce each other in the chat today. So please drop your name and the organization or neighborhood you are connected with that is most related to why you have joined this session and this effort. Thank you for doing that. And as a reminder for those who are here on Tuesday, and as context for those who are joining for the first time today, over the course of these three gatherings and follow-up interviews, what we're really trying to do is create shared understanding, a shared understanding of the history of development in Minneapolis and St. Paul and those cycles of oppression, unrest, and rebuilding that have happened here and across the nation. Understanding of the systems and policies and beliefs that have hindered and accelerated the healthy, racially equitable, and environmentally just development that we're aiming for. And understanding of what you and others have been experiencing as you have worked to both envision and actually create a better built environment. The hurdles, the roadblocks that you've experienced, as well as those things that you've encountered that are helping you make that positive difference that you envision. And overall, what we're aiming for, the best of what's possible in the built environment and in the systems that guide it. So after these three sessions and interviews, we will convene again and share back what we've learned from you and what we've learned together in the form of a change agenda for your review and feedback. That agenda will focus on the roadblocks to be removed and the bright spots to be leveraged in order to achieve the best of what's possible in these areas of the Twin Cities. It is intended to be a multi-sector change agenda, so focused on change in governments, the work of businesses, nonprofits, and grant makers. And the intention of this effort, what we're working to do is share that agenda broadly, widely, and inspire hope and purpose and action. In terms of today's session, we're going to start by not all that briefly recapping a few of the highlights from Tuesday night's conversation. I was saying as we got started that if any of you are old enough, like me, I'm over 50, I remember the FedEx guy and how quickly he spoke. I am going to speak quickly and succinctly in trying to bring forward Tuesday's conversation into this one. After that, I'm going to share some additional context around the best in development and how we might get there. And then we'll roughly divide the remaining time into three sections, similar to how we did on Tuesday: history, hurdles, and hope. Paul will share his observations and learnings. Tabatha will open it up to all of you to build on those observations from your own insights and experience. And just as with Tuesday, we ask that you be as specific as possible. People were great about that, in sharing the specific situations that they've run into and frustrations they've had, projects or programs that have given them hope, That's the kind of input that we're looking for today. We also, again, are going to put out that ask to you for your help in identifying people or organizations that you think should be involved in informing this change agenda. I'm going to ask that we put Christina's email address back in the chat today. And if there are folks that you think should be connected to this effort, please reach out to Christina at ppna.org, and we'll connect those folks to what we're doing here. We are recording these sessions with those folks in mind. One last note before we get started. We would love to see your faces. I appreciate many of you having your cameras turned on. We also know that for one reason or another, you may have to step away for a few minutes. You may have to turn off your camera. That can also be okay. Take the time you need, if and when you need it, at any point during our session. So, to get us started, I wanted to prime your thinking and bring you back to the key points of conversation from Tuesday night, where we, are wanting to build on that work today. And Paul did an amazing job of bringing us through many, many decades of history and a huge swath of change that has happened. Forces that have driven the change and the stagnation that we've experienced. So I'm going to quickly run through all of this, really just to prime your brain, get you back in this headspace, because I know we've all had a morning. We've all had a lot of other things going on that have taken our brain to other places. We want to bring you back here. So starting with land and its ownership has always been used as a tool for injustice, from the conquest of native lands to slavery to broken promises of reparations, following emancipation and exclusion from federal land ownership programs. The lack of wealth from land ownership contributes to an ongoing legacy of inequality. An incredible and painful statistic that Paul brought forward in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the Black community owned less than 1% of the US wealth. And that number has barely budged in over 150 years. Under the Homestead Act, 246 million acres was given away in the Midwest and the West, including in Minnesota. 1.6 million white families benefited from this program of land ownership. Only 6,000 Black families did. And this program also continued the displacement of Native people. Jim Crow, state-sanctioned white supremacy, impacted every aspect of the built environment, all the places where people live and work and learn and shop and recreate. And the places that were accessible to Black people were also intentionally sited next to environmental hazards, affecting their health and well-being and ability to generate wealth. The Great Migration led 6 million African Americans to move from the rural South to urban cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. In these places, land continued to be used as a tool for injustice. Participants indicated that they saw slavery and Native American genocide as the biggest contributors to inequity in land ownership and development. You all also brought forward additional historic moments during the same historical period that have contributed significantly to inequity in development. The Dakota War of 1862, the GI Bill, and who had access to it and who didn't, and the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. We went on to hurdles, and the hurdles identified included not recognizing or addressing the racism built into past and continuing policies, not recognizing the legacy effects of these policies. As Sam put it, it's hard to win a race that's already started. Not valuing and ceding power to BIPOC communities and ensuring a strong number of BIPOC professionals are available to develop their own communities and neighborhoods. Another hurdle that historically we have been too focused on outputs, not enough on outcomes. That there have been patterns of extraction that are core to the real estate industry, including beliefs that Black homeowners pose a risk to the housing market. Capital stacks, the mix of financing sources for development and how they're structured, have been extractive in nature. Equitable approaches to capital stacks would be those that have a different balance of risk and return and focus on holistic community development and community self-determination. Another hurdle is that there has often been more focus on developing buildings than developing people. Participants in the session noted additional hurdles, including the trauma that people of color carry in their bodies, genetically passed down through the generations. Difficulties of Black contractors in trying to work with the city of Minneapolis's vacant block program. Lack of access to capital for Black people. Difficulties with the paperwork and regulations related to development, hurdles that are especially experienced by Black people and people of color who may be less connected to the people and processes of the system. Lack of familiarity with and appreciation for our nation's history. A lot of what Paul shared has not been taught in school, or little time has been spent on it. Participants also noted structural disparities as the biggest contributing factor to the hurdles that are along the path toward equitable development. Louis noted that getting past hurdles involves either lowering the height of the hurdle or giving people stilts, and that our solutions will likely need to involve both of those strategies. Gladys and others noted the hoarding of information and resources as a problem, a hurdle that can be overcome. And then in the realm of hope, that hope and inspiration can come from the fact that these discussions are happening. It can come from projects in other states like Mercy Corps in Portland, where 54% of investors make less than $40,000 per year. Those investors in that project are making it happen. NICO, the neighborhood investment company operating in Los Angeles, that's working to democratize wealth creation, where residents are able to invest as little as $100 in a project that they care about. The Inclusive Capital Collective, which focuses on residents investing in and acquiring vacant properties. Participants mentioned additional bright spots, among them the LISC Community Asset Transition Fund. Gladys mentioned helpful resources for small business development, small business creation from the West Broadway Neighborhood Coalition. Participants also indicated that the leading accelerant for equitable development would be reparations for Black and Indigenous people and people of color, followed closely by redistribution of wealth. Russ noted that a combination of reparations, equitable zoning, and revised development policies may be a path forward. There was discussion of how pure capitalism isn't going to create what's needed, and we need to pay attention to so-called market failures, that those can be instructive. Shanae brought forward the importance of paying attention to the voices and ideas of young people and investing in those ideas in development. And another place of inspiration came from this reference time in history that we were focused on in session 1, but in another place in the country. How can we create a sustainable Black and brown Wall Street like that which once existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma? So that is my very brief, fast recap of a 2.5-hour session. I would love to hear from the rest of you who were here on Tuesday of anything else that you are recalling from that discussion that I didn't mention that you want to make sure is at the fore as we dive into session 2. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to keep going. If something comes to you, put it in the chat. Please put it in the chat. All right. I now want to bring forward just 2 additional pieces of context that I think are going to be helpful in our work today. One is the idea of satisficing. Now, spell check does not like this word at all. It turns it every time to satisfying. It reminds me that this is not very popular as a word, but it is a really popular concept. It pervades our thinking in all aspects of what we aspire to related to the built environment. It's defined as a decision-making strategy that aims for a satisfactory or adequate result, rather than aiming for the best and most optimal solution. So the idea here is that instead of putting maximum effort toward attaining the ideal outcome, satisficing focuses on being pragmatic. It's the idea that aiming for that optimal solution requires what is seen as too much time, too much energy, too many resources. That is too hard. Satisficing narrows our range of options. It sets aside options that would call for more intensive or complex solutions and are seen as unfeasible by a lot of people. So the systems related to development in government, in financial institutions, in nonprofits and foundations are all geared toward satisficing as opposed to the best of what's possible. So in these areas affected in the unrest, there lies a real opportunity to dream bigger, to really say, what are we aiming for? And to ask why not aim for the best of what's possible here. So in addition to satisficing and really kind of an extension of that idea is the other concept that I wanted to bring forward to you today. It's a framework called 21st century development. I'm going to very briefly describe it. It may come in useful in our third session. And I'm going to ask Angie, I know this is out of the blue, but I wonder if you would be able to share your screen a little differently and go to the website of 21stcenturydevelopment.org. And it can just, we can bring folks through this website just very briefly as I try to describe what it brings forward. So the core idea is that 21st century developments are ones that benefit all people and all living systems. This framework was something that we developed with Brian Lee Jr., who his work focuses on equity in development. He works out of New Orleans. And he collaborated with us and the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota to develop this. Angie, if you can scroll down to the development matrix and click on that. Yep, there you go, right in the middle. And then if you can just open up all of those tabs under place and water and energy, and I'll talk you through kind of what you're seeing in what Angie's opened up here, not the details of it, but the general nature of it. So what we're trying to do here is illuminating a path from standard development, like what we see most often and what the market and the systems are most geared toward creating, from standard level development through different levels of better development, all the way to regenerative level, which is really the best of what we know is actually possible to create in the built environment. We've also started to identify hurdles along the path. And Angie, if you can kind of scroll slowly down through here, you can see these indications where there's a dollar sign, and then you'll see a P show up at a different place. We've started to identify where there are really significant financial hurdles and really big policy hurdles to getting to that regenerative level. We also realize, as you talked about on Tuesday, that the hurdles that we're dealing with are more than financial. They're more than policy. They relate to our beliefs and to the political and community will to do better. You can stop sharing that now, Angie, and go back to the PowerPoint. So money, policies, but also time and values and beliefs, the mindsets that we hold about how the world should operate are the things that really drive what happens in the built environment. And we tend to be presented choices that are in that realm of satisficing. They're in that realm, they can be thought of as false choices that are shaped by those same forces. You know, like, for example, the idea that we have to choose between having enough places that people can afford to live and places that are made of healthy materials that don't contribute to climate change and put the health and happiness of the people who live there first. So that framework that we teed up is complex, and it's unhelpful for us to dig into the details today, but especially with Shanae's comments in mind from Tuesday, I wanted to bring forward how young people in North Minneapolis have described this framework, have described the best of what's possible. We worked with youth apprentices at Juxtaposition Arts to look at that regenerative level and help us figure out how can we get people to embrace the best of what's possible. And they said that we just need people to ask different questions and ask better questions. We need everybody who's involved in development, every resident, every developer, everyone in government, and all, you know, nonprofits related to building and designing the built environment, to ask questions like these. And these were questions that were developed by youth related to what they want in their built environment. So these questions are, how will our environment be protected and made stronger? How much food will people be able to grow in this development, in this space? How much green space will be created for us? How easily can people walk, bike, or take public transit to where they need to go? Next slide. In the area of water, they want us to ask, will this development use less water than a typical development? How will this development clean and reuse contaminated water? How will it prevent contaminated water from entering our rivers and lakes? How much water will this development get from a public utility system, and how much from reused rainwater? In terms of energy, they want us to ask how much of this development's energy will come from renewable sources like wind and solar. Can this development produce its own energy? When it produces more energy than it uses, can the energy be stored? Can this development produce enough clean energy to send it to other places? In health and happiness, they want us to ask, how will people build community here? How will this development help people live a healthy life? How easily can people experience nature? How prepared will this development be for a natural disaster? In terms of the materials that are used, they want to know where the materials come from and what their impact is on the environment and on people. They want us to ask how this development can put less carbon dioxide into the air and how the construction process can produce less waste. In the realm of equity specifically, how can this place be accessible to diverse people? Will people experience fresh air, sunlight, and plants, both inside and out? How easily can people access what they need? How does this development bring more money into the existing community? And how are residents involved in the design? And then finally, in the realm of beauty, They want us to ask, what kind of public art will there be? How will it connect people to each other and to the environment? And how will this development inspire people to create better developments elsewhere? So that's just an overview of a couple of additional pieces of context that we wanted to bring to you today. And I just want to open this up for the next few minutes for any thoughts on the context that we shared, the recap of Tuesday's session, or this, introduction to these ideas of satisficing and to how can we think differently and have different conversations about what we're aiming for and the best of what's possible. And Angie, you can stop sharing screen now. Thank you.
So this is Sam speaking from the Powderhorn resident hat, and also one of the instructors at Juxta, who I remember working with them on this when they were putting that together. And it's nice to see that I'm actually assigning that as a reading for urban studies class I'm teaching, because I want them to review that as a matrix. I love a lot of the things in there. I'm just wondering, so what are the hurdles to us? So the history, hurdles, and hope, right? So we had the history. I guess we're talking about some of the hurdles now, and I'm assuming the hope is going to come on Monday when we all talk of solutions. So I think, if we're talking about hurdles today, all of those goals sound great, but it's how do we, I can't make my clients pay for a more green building than they have money for, right? I can't build a more green building than I have money for. My house is extremely old. It was built in 1904. We basically have insulation on the ceiling, but the walls are like hollow. So like my own house where my family is, where I'm paying the utility bill and benefiting from these fossil fuels that are coming in here to like keep me and my family warm and my pipes from bursting, is not built to the standard I would love. But I love my house. I mean, I love this neighborhood, but most of the houses here were built prior to World War II. So there's an understanding of all that stuff. So I think some of the hurdles is, existing buildings in place, not meeting certain standards. There really is no programs, or maybe there are, but they're complicated to, winterize your house, make it more accessible. And, I think a handful of people, I've looked into that and thought about doing that at some point down the line. But yeah, I think moving forward, it's going to be easier to apply it for new development, but even still, that withstanding, not every client wants to do LEED or wants to do, what is it? I think B3 or whatever. So there's just a lot of, the hurdles are many, right? To understand it, then even once you understand it, to implement it, and then even if you want to understand it and know the process, you need the resources to do it. But I loved all of those goals, and I think they're great things to build towards. And yeah, just thinking about this moment in time, and I'm seeing stuff with wildfires, I'm seeing stuff with tornadoes, I'm seeing stuff. I mean, it's real, it's hitting home. We're all in this together, so we're going to have to find a way. And then I want to know, what is our crisis response? 2020 taught me that we're very underprepared, and I'm seeing that just kind of drag along. Everybody's expecting things to get back to normal, and I kind of feel this is the switch. Like 2020 was like, welcome to the future, we're here, and this is going to keep coming, one thing after another. So how is our built environment responding to that? Like my daughter is over at a friend's house playing, because I think kids need to be around other kids. And as much as I'm concerned about, Omicron and whatever, I'm more concerned about, social skills and building up that. And honestly, like, I mean, I'm going on a tangent, but like, people not having access to public spaces is leading to an unsafe environment. Like during that whole defund, blah, 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 police, I mean, let's get these kids back in school. Let's get these kids in hoop program. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think we need to utilize the buildings better, with better programs for what we do have, because people aren't giving the opportunity to even use. We could have great buildings and then everybody's sitting at home because we don't have the policies to get people in buildings or in safe spaces, and then they do unsafe things. So kind of a tangent on the last part,
No,
but
I
yeah, I think
appreciate it,
there's a
Sam.
lot of hurdles.
Yeah, absolutely. And our thought is the more that we can bring those hurdles and this context to the fore in these conversations, the more specific we can start to get about the hurdles that we need, that we've identified, that need to be dismantled, and what's going to get us to that place of hope. So that is the intention. Thank you.
And Mary
Any other-
Margaret, if I can
Go
just,
ahead, Tabatha. Yeah.
yeah, so I just wanted to, because there was a poll question that I created. It's the only one of the day. So everyone don't panic and break out into a sweat. We're doing things a little bit different than on Tuesday night. But a couple of things that I want to do and acknowledge, because in part, you know, Sam mentioned that he shared a lot. I certainly don't think it was a tangent. I think it was all beautifully related. And so that's what I wanted to lift up. A couple of things is that we know that these conversations can feel, and this does not mean that you have to feel this way. Oftentimes, these collective assessment of where we are and where do we want to go can feel weighty. They can feel overwhelming in a variety of instances. And what we're hoping to do is to not have folks feel as if this workshop series is aimed at solving. It's not aimed at fixing. The spirit of it is to understand that in life, the things that we become aware of that touch our hearts and our minds, that we will probably be able to rub up against a fraction of all the things that we want to see different. And that can sometimes be the totality of what life brings for us. But by doing that, by touching some of it, I think it creates a great path for other generations to kind of figure out or touch the stuff that maybe we right now won't get to. So even if we don't touch it all, fix it all, which is not the goal, being able to be in shared space to begin to think through what does our action, collective or individual or otherwise, looks like, we hope is still feels like a healthy practice. What I would also want to lift up in terms of 21st century development, and that those principles, is that if you did a quick Google, you're going to see a variety of things that talk about 21st century development, 21st century design, user experience. And a lot of that, I'm going to just say for me, is an attempt to center people and an attempt to have all the systems, not one system, be well. And I think that that's what the difference is. For me, within 21st century design, is that it's the difference between what happens if all the things in life are considered and well, versus current models, which is a bit skewed toward capitalism in our country being well, and global capitalism, meaning the system is set up to develop things for oftentimes more transactional profit than whether or not a group of people and or the environment or all the intersectionalities of life are well. And so it's part of my hope and thinking is that through this conversation and through so many more conversations and actions, that we begin to think through how do we become agents of and champions for paradigm shifts that leads to behavioral shifts. Because we have seen, even when we see principles adopted or accepted, like constructs like housing is a human right, that policies and systems are put in place in an attempt to support that, like affordable housing trust funds. There could be, in our lifetime, a paradigm shift trust fund, right? Where we are acknowledging that to get to where we want to go, a lot needs to change and a lot needs to be touched. So that's just me for what it's worth attempting to say. 21st century development, to me, as Mary Margaret laid out, is not just about the built environment. It is about all the environments and all the things that exist in the environment. And what will it take for us to be able to center the wellness of things and not the transaction of things? So Richard, if you want to, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, No, I think this is a great discussion. I mean, as someone who is part of the development of this thing, I think early on in the recap, there was a comment that there's too much focus on developing buildings versus people. And I think that's kind of spot on and still a little bit maybe a bias of what's in the 21st century development stuff, because I think you have to start one of the ideas behind this was that there ought to be community conversations about the specific culture in a place, the specific environment in a place, and those should lead to a collective vision of what does good look like. And this matrix was just, okay, well, here's a list of stuff that could be part of that vision of what good looks like. But to Sam's point and your point, I think it's got to start with the conversation of focus on people and social systems and those things, and then come over to buildings and infrastructure and environmental things and that kind of stuff, and what's possible and what should be a priority in a particular place. The other thing I just want to say is, even though it has a fancy website and looks all kind of finished, it's also meant to be a start, and feel free to critique, change, say that's wrong. It was also meant to be something that had blanks in it, where, as a part of a community conversation, groups would add stuff to it and say, this isn't part of this matrix, but this other issue is really a driver for us, and this is what good looks like around that particular issue. So anyway, I thought that was just additional context.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and throw up the poll, and then at that point, we're going to quickly-ish turn it over to Paul, who will begin to facilitate the first wave of reflection and discussion around history, hurdles, and hope 2.0. So Tuesday was 1.0. So just give me 1 second. So the poll is launched. If you guys can go ahead and take maybe 30 seconds to respond to that, that will be great. Let's just get a temperature check for us in the room. Record time response. And so I would say the news isn't all bad. I think that this is us probably clinging to what Kim lifted up at the end of Tuesday's session, is that anything is possible, that if we keep an open mind, that is what can be part of our guiding light in terms of how do we begin to affect and influence the communities that we believe we deserve and that we need to be whole. So thank you for responding to that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Tabatha. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's great to be here again and to continue this conversation. I'm going to try and continue the history part. Just so everyone knows, after the other night, I did not know what I was going to talk about today. So it was a long night yesterday figuring this out, but hopefully it will work. What I'm going to try to do today is really have a discussion around history, kind of centered around housing, something that we all talk about, something that we all need. As Tabatha said, it really is a human right, and how housing has impacted neighborhoods, cities, towns, and what the policies and social conditions and economics that have driven a lot of what we see that we take for granted and why it's there. So we left off with the Great Migration, whatever day that was. See, today's Thursday. What day was that? Tuesday night? Tuesday night, yeah. Tuesday night. So again, 6 million African Americans moved out of the rural South to the urban cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and the West. So between the 1910s and 1970s, one of the most profound changes in American history, if you can think of that many people picking up from one geographic area and moving to other geographic areas, and the impact that had, not just physically, but culturally, socially, as we think about, what came out of the Great Migration, how the blues migrated, Motown. I mean, all of these things that happened out of the Great Migration and all the changes. So now you have this huge number of people moving to cities and places that weren't prepared for them physically. Where were all these people gonna live? Most of these cities and neighborhoods were already segregated. It wasn't like, hey, great, we're all integrated. Come on, you Black folks, work in our factories and you can live amongst us all. It was like, no, come and work in our factories, but we only really want you to live in these spots. So we continued to have, this impact of segregated communities across the United States and this really crowding of neighborhoods where people are living, multiple families living in one unit, tenements, et cetera, which as we move forward, we're going to see the drive to what that meant for housing policy and city development. So we've got that going on. And then during this whole Great Migration period, we have like significant things that happened during that time period. We had the recession, we had World War II, we had the beginning of suburbanization in the United States. And these are all really big time social and economic policy drivers. So in 1933, home ownership was really expensive. Basically, middle-class families could not own homes. So most people were renting. Because to own a home then, your mortgage required a 50% down payment, and you had interest-only payments, and you were supposed to be done in 5 to 7 years. Okay, so if you think about that, how many people could actually do that? Or after 7 years, you had to refinance. So the Depression comes and makes this even worse. The government's like, okay, we really want to try and get home ownership going, not just because people are suffering, but also because we're looking for a way to get the building industry and real estate working again and produce dollars. So this work became part of the New Deal, and we all know about the New Deal, but really the New Deal, was white affirmative action because it took state resources and it used it to provide direct financial advantages, mostly to white Americans at the expense of other racial groups. So, when you're thinking about the New Deal and things like Social Security and all those other things, you have to remember that originally farm workers and domestic workers were excluded from that, which in the South is 40% of the African American population. All right, so we get back to home ownership. So the government created the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, which was invented to purchase these mortgages that people had that were basically in default, ready to be foreclosed. And what they did is they refinanced them and they created really the modern mortgage product. So they said, okay, you can pay for this over 25 years. We're going to amortize it, which means, some of your payment goes to principal, some of it goes to interest, and you're building equity while you're doing this. So if you sell your home while you're still doing the mortgage, whatever the value is, the equity, you get to take that with you. So that was the beginning of, okay, really, how do we use single family home ownership as a wealth building strategy? However, the real problem was that the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, you could only be white to get in the program. So if you had managed as an African American to get a house and you were in default, the Home Ownership Loan Corporation was not going to help you out. Not only that, redlining comes from the Home Ownership Loan Corporation defining neighborhoods, where they would actually do their work, loan, and green was good, and those are white neighborhoods, and red was bad, those are black neighborhoods, and that's how we get redlining. So we had, no equity, baked into the process. Okay, so we continue, on that whole piece, and then the government was like, hey, we want to get people who are renting to be first-time home buyers, who really were having a problem being home buyers. So they invented the Federal Housing Administration, right? And that's in 1934. The FHA insured bank mortgages that covered 80% of the housing costs, right? So this now is like a bonanza in terms of how could you buy a house, how could you become a homeowner. Again, the FHA had its own appraisal standards, and it was whites only. So now the government, you know, racial segregation had now become an official requirement of the federal government, because the mortgage standards and the underwriting standards says we will not insure African Americans, period. No questions, period. And at that time period when these were developed, the code of ethics in the real estate industry said we will not sell to African Americans. So we have this double whammy of the real estate industry, you know, we won't sell, and the major financial products of the time that were created would not serve anybody but white homeowners. So you can already see how this is impacting communities. So we're beginning to get this shift. You know, we talk about right now home ownership disparities, and we look at who owns a home and who doesn't, and we still have this huge disparity between BIPOC communities and white communities. Like it's in the DNA of how we get to own homes, right? So we continue, you know, so we continue to see that. So during this time period, while this is going on, the population is like skyrocketing. So in Chicago, the Black population increased 77% in the 1940s. It went from 278,000 Black people to 492,000. And in the 1950s, it grew by another 65% to 813,000. So there's this huge swell, there's this huge pressure on housing, right? What's going on with the pressure on housing? Well, you know, people are doing whatever they can. So you move, you move in with your friends and family, you try to figure out where you're gonna go, you're having this continual pressure on the existing housing stock. A lot of it was already in bad shape, it's even in worse shape now. You have speculators taking advantage of that situation, continuing to divide up housing so that they can get more and more people into it. You have the whole thing about contract for deeds, you know, trying to sell people properties, you know, based on you make these payments. And, you know, at the end, you know, you have a balloon, but if you miss one payment, you're out and you lost every dime that you ever put in. So we have all of this going on, while at the same time, the federal government is saying, when we fund public housing, affordable housing, it still has to be segregated. So all we continue to do is make this rift. You know, if we build housing over here, and you have to remember that, you know, originally public housing was not a bad word, and you know, lots of white immigrants lived in public housing in cities. So it was not how people tend to, you know. So we've changed that. We don't use public housing anymore. We use affordable housing, whatever word you want to use. But if you do your history, you know, there were plenty of you know, white families who were happy when the government built public housing. What happened is the government would not build, and cities would not build integrated public housing. They would not let Black people live in neighborhoods that had better resources, better schools, access. None of that went on, right? So that's continuing to go on, and that's continuing to have a drastic impact. Okay, so now we get to the end of World War II. We have all kinds of people coming back the veterans are all coming back to home, including Black veterans who fought for their country overseas. The housing crisis is even worse, because now you've got veteran families, you know, the United States, like, we want to keep this economy going, you know, that's been booming during the war. We got to figure out how to house these people. So in 1949, President Truman proposed a new public housing effort, because there's this severe shortage, because of all the millions of people returning, the veterans, et cetera. And this one originally was going to be that it was going to be integrated. So the government was like, we're going to build public housing, it's going to be integrated. Unfortunately, politics, as a lot of times reared its ugly head, Southern Democrats pushed back and said, no, we're not going to do that. And if you want to get this money, then you have to make the bill include that housing's going to be segregated. So one of Minnesota's senators, Hubert Humphrey, fought hard against this bill, but lost that battle. So that produced, millions of dollars for housing. A lot of it went to the clearance of Black neighborhoods to build housing for whites, and then urban renewal, and then what we see is the creation of massive segregated high rises across the United States, clustered in tight Black spaces. This is where we get Robert Taylor homes, Cabrini Green, Van Dyke houses in New York, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. For all you architects, that was famously blown up because it was so bad. So they demoed Pruitt-Igoe. But that's really how we got here and how we got these concentrations. Okay. So after World War II, the other thing that the FHA did is really support suburbanation. Okay. So builders like Levitt and other people said, hey, we can go out, Levittown in New York, which was in a potato field on Long Island, build these houses spec. But how did they do that? They were financed by the FHA. That's how they did that. And what's the code of the FHA? Only white people can live here. So this is the driver for how what we think about is now the typical suburban subdivision where, builder builds these houses, they build them on spec. Like, that really wasn't done on any scale, until after World War II. And it wasn't done until the government said, okay, we'll finance this and we'll take the risk out of this, because if someone defaults on their mortgage, we're covering it. So now you can afford to go do that. So we begin to see, the donut where people are leaving the cities, they're going out here to the suburbs, they're taking their, they're taking their energy, their money, etc. And the cities start to become painted as, well, this is a place where only poor people live, and it really sets up white flight, decimation of inner city neighborhoods, and really the decline in cities from like the 1960s to the 1980s. If you know your history, New York was bankrupt in the 1970s. This is before everybody wanted to move back downtown. And and it's okay to rent if you live in a $1 million condo. But it was okay, no, everyone wants to live outside of the city, and that's a place I don't want to go, and I don't want to be there if I don't have to. Right. And that also then, in terms of social programs, jobs, all of that, and if you think about, where industry was going, where it went, corporate headquarters on the outskirts of downtown, if we want to think about here, like General Mills, like these big campuses, that modern architects loved and designed, they were all on the outskirts of cities. And a lot of them were self-contained, 3M, like all of them were developed in this time frame, where it was an exodus. So I wanted to give you that, and then I want to give you an example of a project that was trying to counter that whole thing, and really was when it was developed, was someone looking at, how do I use the built environment to create hope and to create opportunities for African Americans? So this is a project called Soul City, and it was in North Carolina. It was developed by Floyd McKissick. It was founded in 1969. Floyd McKissick was a lawyer, and he was in charge of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, which back in the day was major. And he was dedicated to Black economic empowerment. So his idea was to bring money and opportunity to an area that had been left behind. And like I said, that was in North Carolina, and he wanted to develop this new city. And, it was projected by the year 2000, it would boast 24,000 jobs and a population of about 50,000 people. It was located on 5,000 acres of land, which had formerly been a slave plantation in one of the poorest parts of the state. When they acquired the land, it had nothing, no water, no sewer systems, no paved roads. It was like, we're doing this from scratch. Okay. Floyd's dream was about economic equality. It's a really interesting time period because Floyd, they get their money from the Nixon administration, which is pretty bizarre, because the Nixon administration was all about law and order. Basically, the Nixon administration coined this term law and order as a way to tamp down on communities of color, right? But Nixon was looking for a way to get Black votes and to show that, he was thinking about equity, even though we didn't use that term then. So they got a loan through this program. It was $14 million to prepare the land. And this money was part of a program to finance 13 new communities across the country, including our own Riverside Plaza got money from this program to get developed. Soul City was the only project in a rural area and the only one led by a Black developer. It got off to a great start. Ultimately, unfortunately, it failed. By the time they foreclosed 10 years later, there were just 135 jobs and 124 full-time residents. So why did Soul City fail? A couple reasons. One, if you think about this, it's 1969. The name for a lot of people was an issue. The push then was, we want to be integrationist, and integration is the path to civil rights. And being authentically Black, flew in the face, particularly of white finance people and lenders. And even some civil rights folks were like, well, all right, this is where Floyd was like, nope. I might have made a deal with the devil with getting in bed with Nixon and Republicans, but I'm not going to change the name. So he kept the name, but he also just battled the fact that, if you think about it, starting a city from scratch, it's like a huge undertaking for anybody, for really well-backed, corporate, white developers, it would be a huge undertaking. But, for a Black guy without deep pockets and no corporate backing, dealing with economic downturns in the 1970s, it was really hard. Not to mention just dealing with the scrutiny, the over-the-top scrutiny that this kind of endeavor got from government and everybody else. So there were challenges that there was financial misfeasance. The local papers basically decided, we're gonna write every story we can think about that's bad, and they just struggled. They were clear there was no financial misfeasance, but once that gets out there, people really don't want to invest. However, if we look at history too, this program also supported places like Columbia, Maryland, Reston, Virginia, the Woodlands in Texas, all successful new cities built out of the middle of nowhere. So if you go to Reston now or Columbia, Maryland, any of these places, they're all really successful and they all work. They all started from scratch at the same time. They're in the same period. They were also all developed by white development companies. I think the big takeaway here for this project was one that, really what this was about was Black people having self-determination. They were going to be the people who designed the city, developed the city, ran the city, police force, etc. That's what it was about. And it was a way to say, okay, we're going to use the development of the built environment to create a place that's safe, that's ours, that's culturally about us, it's economically benefiting us on a grand scale. It was a huge strategy then. It's one now that we would have a hard time pulling off. So, if we think about where we are now, because the financial gap between Black and white households has hardly budged between the time that Floyd was trying to do Soul City and where we're at now, right? And so that goes, to my continuing thread of this history is showing us that we are not moving forward on a lot of these measures. And we are all BIPOC people. We're still seeking that self-determination. We're still looking for, Sam talked about, well, how, can I get this done? We're still looking at that. And when we look at what's happened in our own city and in cities across the country, we're all still asking that, we're all still asking for respect, dignity, and control over our own destiny. Because really, Soul City didn't work because white people decided they didn't want it to work. At the end of the day, that's the real reality. And the irony of the whole thing is that the one industrial building they got built has now been turned into a correctional facility. So it's like, it can't get any worse. But there's a great book, and I think Christina put it in the chat, about Soul City and Floyd McKissick, because it's a forgotten history. Like, I didn't learn about it. I never heard about it. Certainly in architecture school, nobody ever mentioned Soul City, in North Carolina. So for me, that's gotta we talk about history and its impact and its continuation. I wanted to end on that because I wanted to talk about, how we've been working on this, and people who, before us have been continuing to try to do this work. And we may call it 21st century design now, or whatever other words, but really, it's the ongoing struggle and process that we've been going through to make this change in how the built environment impacts us.
All right. Again, we start off light here with the history, hurdles, and hope, not much to see. No, seriously, thank you, Paul, again, for really contextualizing some of the history. And even what I think is helpful is kind of narrowing in on one area of development in terms of housing. So really just opening it up to the group in terms of thoughts, reactions to some of the things that Paul has shared, as we are looking a little bit more in a hyper-local way around, or at least around a topic within development related to housing, and who and how systems and institutions really help to perpetuate many of the disparities that we're often quoting with respect to Black ownership and white ownership in the country. So thoughts, reactions, questions. And again, as a reminder, you can drop it in the chat if there's something that comes up for you that you think you would like to share. You don't have to put your voice into the space.
I guess I have a couple of things just to share that, pop up in my mind. I have been involved in the community with helping Crystal Porter run for city council over North Minneapolis for last election. And I'm a board member of Minneapolis Climate Action, where we have been doing a lot of projects. We have a community solar garden over north, and the other one is in the merge recycling facility. And James Staples actually developed this project. And when it comes to housing, and I will bring both of them together, I guess, because I learned a lot being out in the community, speaking to homeowners or renters actually, where or business owners, where they are renting these spaces but they don't own. And I'm thinking about the development that's happening, or that will happen, with the light rail over North Minneapolis, and what that what that will cause these business owners, and the idea of, you know, putting them somewhere else, these businesses, and then what happens? You know, people from Edina or whatever are gonna come and move there, but then, or, you know, new development will go up, but then these families, these business owners are not going to be able to, you know, pay rent or whatever. So when I was with Christelle, her idea about creating an accessible way that is done through policies for people to stop renting and start owning is something that's very important. And I definitely think that policies have a big play in every part of this project of development. I mean, when we think about I mean, the environment and things like that, people don't know that the highest rates of asthma in children are over in North Minneapolis. And people don't know that the incinerator for the entire Hennepin County is over North Minneapolis. You know, so why is that? And that's a problem that I have. That's something that will only change if these policies change. You know, being a member of Minneapolis Climate Action and wanting to have access to solar electricity and save money in electricity and all this stuff it's been amazing to be a part of that project, but it's been a nightmare to get that project through because of Excel, because of monopolies that, you know, policies that don't allow projects like these, innovative projects, to go through simply, right? And instead of, you know, allowing a community solar project, I know another business that over some town over over somewhere in Minnesota, that a person that I met with, they have like 350 megawatts of electricity, and they're selling it to their biggest client is Amazon. You know, Amazon is benefiting from solar electricity, which is amazing. Great for them, you know. But why aren't North Minneapolis residents or just people that rent have access to this so simply? So there are so many things that go into it, but I definitely feel like policy has a big issue in really getting anything done.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Gladys. And I think that just to, I think your comments are noted in the sense that it can feel as if there's a lot intertwined that makes progress difficult. Things are very much knotted up, and maybe for people on the call who wear jewelry with a fine necklace, sometimes if that ever gets in a knot, like that's not something you can just pull apart. Like sometimes you really just have to sit there and take your time and unravel it. And that's, I think, comparable to many of the things that we are facing by wanting to be a part of these conversations, not about only about understanding how knotted and interwoven many of the policies and systems and institutions are to perpetuate a particular outcome. So that's just me saying, I think that as much as we might feel that things are knotted and complicated and not working, I think that there's another group that would say, no, this is actually working exactly like we want it to work. So good luck trying to unravel it, because you got to be, you know, paying attention on all fronts, which, to be the truth of life, is that that's very difficult to do. And that's not because we all need to do all the things at the same time, but being able to activate a community, being able to activate leaders to figure out what policies need to be unraveled, which systems need to be advanced, and what things, quite frankly, we need to walk away from. And I'm just going to throw out there, even the narrative, even the idea that home ownership is the path, because there's other points of view. Even if we think about persons who have put forward, you know, decolonization manifestos and mindsets, about what are we trying to replicate and what are we trying to maintain would suggest that some of what we need just may not be currently reflected in the community. It just may not be a system, to be fair to what capitalism can do, that has to be something else other than what we have in order to get to integrated systems that are healthy, right? In order for communities to be healthy, in order for people to be healthy, in order for people to have access. That's just me saying, again, as the caution, we may not be able to get to what we sometimes espouse and aspire to have through our modern capitalistic system. So if there's no other comments, I'm going to toss it back over to Paul, as again, gave us a lot to think about in terms of history as it relates to housing in this country and who housing was built for, to go a little bit more into our next wave or movement of hurdles.
One other thing I'll just say really quickly is, Paul, at one point you said, hey, this wasn't taught to me in school from an architecture standpoint, and like, hey, making sure that these things are taught, right? Because we just know that there is learning, and sometimes we can spark that interest and desire to make a difference in somebody that they just need to know that it exists. And I realize, we sometimes feel like there's aren't enough of those people, but for that history to be taught and to be a part of it, not just the history of white men who made an impact in the industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim, for that. And then Louis, I see that you had a comment in the chat. Is there anything else that you would want to add to that? And when I say I saw, Mary Margaret saw, and Mary Margaret was like, yo, you should see if Louis wants to aspire. And I was like, that's a good idea, Mary Margaret. It takes a team.
Yeah, I mean, the Oldman River City project was, East St. Louis reached out to Buckminster Fuller, who was sort of like not just an architect, but just sort of like one of those guys that had lots of ideas and did lots of things and wore many hats, to help to redesign really much of the city. And so because at the time East St. Louis was very blighted. Lots of people would say right now it kind of still is. What I know is that I know we've talked about how some things have the hurdles are policy based. Sometimes they are money based. As I understand it, and this is just working off of my memory because it's been a while since I looked at it, but I'm pretty sure that the money-based hurdles were these ones here, because they had, all the buy-in from the city leaders, of course, to more or less rebuild the city. And it was supposed to provide, equal housing to so many, I think 70,000 residents at the time. But again, Paul, it runs right into that same sort of time frame that you were looking at. I think 1971, I think, is when this one was. So I don't know a lot more about that. Of course, if other experts know more than I do, I'd love to hear it.
Thanks, Louis. Okay, so we're going to press on. Thank you so much. Paul, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hurdles, but kind of from a lens of hurdles we're identifying that we can all press, and things that we see as we're in these processes that that we could say, why are you doing it that way? So the first one, it came from the other day, like, everyone has brilliance. So everyone in the community has brilliance and should be at the table. Youth, elders, homeless people, whoever, everybody has brilliance. There's a tendency to have a lot of the same suspects at the table every time something is going on. And organizations and institutions and government, it's easy to go, yep, we know these 10 people who we always talk to, and we call them, and they form the nucleus of whatever it is. And then maybe there may be somebody, a couple other people who are like new, and we'll get them in there. All right. So it's important to push for a nope. And engagement's not a one-size-fits-all process. So we have to be varied to get all this brilliance and connect with it all. And power sharing is critical, right? So just being at the table is not enough, right? So pushing for, you have to share the power. This gets to Mary Margaret's, I had demand better, but I'm going to use satisficing, and I can say I've been thrown out of some meetings for satisficing too much. But this is all about, you got to demand better, push the envelope. You got to say, hey, no, that's not good enough. Don't settle for the standard. Be a disruptor. Be willing. Be willing. Somebody explain to Dan what satisficing is. It's in the chat. Be willing to push. Here we are, in Minneapolis, where millions of dollars have poured into our communities. Are we seeing any real innovation? I talked about some strategies and processes and people doing work in development. That's not pie in the sky. That's not like, hey, no one's tried it. It's actually going on. Like, we have resources right now, and some will, to move this. Like, why are we not trying? Why are we not bringing these strategies to our communities right now to make a difference? It's your money, right? It's your money. So don't support the continued enrichment, and Gladys was getting at this, of people from outside the community with public funds in the name of helping you. Because there's this constant, hey, we're going to do this work in, Phillips, North Minneapolis, wherever, and there's public dollars, but why does it always seem to be a white developer? But it's great for the community, right? So, but it's your money. Bonding dollars, right? There's going to be a bonding session, right? Where public money, right? And everybody has to remember, geo bonding from the state is free, because we being the taxpayers, pay the interest rate when the state borrows money to give to projects. So it's our money that's going to projects, and sometimes is it the project you want to do? What difference is it going to make? So, that's really important. We talked about knowledge the other day. Knowledge is really important, and you can build your knowledge easily. There's a massive amount of free information around these systems and processes. Most people have this thing in their pocket, right? Their computer in their pocket that you could look up, right? So even if you one day a week, check into, you don't have to be geeky like me, because I checked how many of these sites that I usually look at, and just on my quick cursory glance, I got about 20. However, even if you go to Next City one day, you can look at Brookings, Project for Public Spaces. There's a ton of great information out there on the web that you can access, and that, is talking about all the same things that we're talking about here. And, you get in one and it directs you to another one, but, we can all build our knowledge on these, and you can focus in on the things that really matter to you. If you really want to, if you're really into renewable energy, there's spaces there. If you really want to get about housing, there's spaces there. If there's wealth building, okay, there's spaces there. If it's general, I'm just an urbanist, there's that. But there's really good information out there that you can access easily and without having to, spend a lot of time. Just like we're doing now, know the history. And I think particularly when we're working in place, like, know how we got here, know what was here before. If you're working on Plymouth Avenue, you have to understand, well, what was here before the Legacy Village? What's that history, right? Like, that was a commercial street with retail on the base and housing above, right? Like, understanding that is really important, right? If you go to Heritage Park, which, the original Sumner Glenwood housing was built in the WPA in 1938, and it was part of all those processes I talked about earlier. So understanding, and then what happened, what was the consent decree about that got them to tear down all the housing? Like, what happened with all of that? To me, this is the big one. Think holistically, right? Just like the 21st century design, jobs, education, environment, health, policy, all that's connected, and we can't separate it out into nice, neat little buckets and say, well, we're just going to work on the housing, and I'm not going to think about the rest of this, right? Because communities don't operate that way. So, you know, you can have great housing and bad education, you have a problem, right? Or you don't have, if people don't have good jobs, then, you know, the kinds of retail or restaurants or whatever you want to support are hard because you need disposable income to do that. So all of this is interconnected to have a healthy community. You know, this goes back to earlier, you know, demand the time to do it right. One of the biggest killers of trying to do stuff are these predetermined, preordained schedules that are like, yep, this is what we're going to do. This is the time frame. And yes, we're going to have authentic community engagement. But if that gets in the way of our schedule, or says, oh, you need to do something different, nope, we're still going to stay on our schedule to get to wherever we need to be, that we decided before we ever got in the room. So pushing this scheduling thing, which does impact capitalism, financing, but you know, Tabatha is right on it. We have to think about those things different. And Tabatha talked about this, so this challenge commonly held beliefs. You know, Minneapolis is a renter city. More people rent than own homes, right? So home ownership is not necessarily better or the only path, but you know, that's the brand, and that's what is sold, because home ownership is a huge economic driver. You know, because if you own a home, you got to buy a washing machine, you got to buy furniture, you got to buy all kinds of stuff. So when people talk about economics, and they'll look at like, well, okay, where is housing? Because it drives so many other things in our community, right? In our economy. And just, you know, even the challenge of, you know, home ownership, private home ownership is not subsidized. Yes, it is. It's called the mortgage tax deduction. It's a huge subsidy to owning a home. If we didn't have that, it would be so much harder to own homes. So it is subsidized by the government. Or the other one, like roads are free and public transportation is subsidized. Well, roads are totally subsidized, right? The gas tax, all kinds of money goes into infrastructure. So how do we challenge these commonly held beliefs that we don't dig into as we think about all this? You know, unfortunately, everything's political. So if you're going to do this work, you got to remember that, yes, politics is everywhere, and not just, you know, at the city level, state level. Politics is in groups. Politics is there. You know, trust but verify. and my last architecture note, like, don't be seduced by the images. You know, because we can come in the room and we can show you all kinds of pretty pictures, but you know, that's not the end all be all. So, you know, dig deeper, ask hard questions, and make the challenges.
You heard them. Dig deeper, ask hard questions, make the challenges, as part of marching orders to taking steps to acknowledge some of the hurdles, deal with some of the hurdles. So I'm going to just pick one, of course, that spoke to me. Is just, does anyone have an example, maybe, is what I would ask, in terms of challenging commonly held beliefs? A commonly held belief that we've seen play out time and time again, that you either have a question mark over the efficacy of that belief in our community, or you know, through some other research or studying that you've done, that is actually not benefiting or fulfilling the thing in our community that most people might have been led to believe over time. And it doesn't have to be that specific, but if someone has something that they want to share about things that you're seeing in community that you've begun to challenge, that you would like to challenge, would just welcome an opportunity for one or two people to share. Go for it, Dan.
Well, I think one that has been brought up a couple of times already is about the idea that home ownership is the path to I don't know what you would call it, but economic sustainability somehow. And again, I don't know the answer. I would like to challenge it. I'd like to unravel that a little bit. I think, Tabatha, you brought up that first really good point. It's like, it's still following this extremely capitalistic model that's about ownership, that's about, this capitalist structure that continues to build once you have this foundation of real estate. But then that's, again, tied in with all these concepts of like, well, what is ownership in terms of the broader community, or, indigenous ways of sharing property and resources and so forth. And that also kind of ties in with, all of the data recently about younger people just not wanting to own a home, like they'd much rather rent because they don't want the responsibilities and expenses that come along with actually owning. And so, I mean, I just think it's an interesting, I don't know, it's something to challenge, about how we get to resilience and stability for people in terms of housing. Related to that, I think, is also this notion about who gets that housing and what type of housing is built, because so often, and again, this is like determined by a very European westernized idea of what is family, is the idea that it's a single family home. And that is, that is a mother and a father and like 2.3 kids or something like that. Whereas, so there's so many broader definitions of what family is, whether that's intergenerational or having, aunts and uncles staying with you, or, multiple families co-housing or something like that. And we still continue to, lather, rinse, repeat this building type. And I think, frankly, it's not serving us all very well. I think there could be much more nuance and variation. So a couple of things that brought up for me.
Thanks, Dan. I won't try to respond to some of the things that you named. I'm going to ask Shanae, you had raised your hand, if you want to jump in with your comments or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I really appreciate like this level of conversation, and like I'm still stuck at satisficing, right? And I'm like, I have all kinds of wonderings about that term, but as it relates to this topic, like how do we differentiate satisficing from like incremental changes that happen naturally, and our level of just how we grow and develop into understanding what the problem actually is, right? I think satisficing is oftentimes framed as, let's just get it done. This is the rate at which change needs to happen in this moment in time. And then we are stuck on like leadership changes or short-term memory, where people don't recognize what promises were put out there, and like who will fulfill it once the stamina changes, or once we receive this change and it seems like success, and then we forget like, hey, we still got things to do, and we still got room to grow, and we still have promises to fulfill. So that's where I'm stuck. Like, I think that satisficing in some situations is adequate, and then it's not when people forget like what they promised, or like what's at stake. And the reality is that it impacts Black and Brown communities the most. And I think somebody threw out the example of George Floyd, and after his murder, right? I think that satisficing is continuing. That pattern of satisficing is like, as we think about Lake Street or 38th Street, people are like jumping at a good opportunity. And while it may seem like a great opportunity in the moment, we have to think about where we were, right? And where we need to be. So that's what I'm like ruminating on. But that's a good term that I'm gonna definitely be throwing out there from this point forward.
Well, listen, I think you said it about 6 times in what you just shared right now. So you are on a good track. I 100% hear you. And the thing that I would add before I kick it over to Ephraim is that I think that what's powerful, what comes up for me that you shared is in this duality that we don't have to, again, put ourselves in common spaces of thinking in terms of it's either satisficing or not, right? Sometimes the incremental gains is us realizing we're at the table, we're making progress. But I think for me, what comes up, Shanae, how do we not get lost in that? One of the things that I've been trying to coach myself and coach the teams that I have an opportunity to work alongside on is understanding the number. So a lot of times when we don't start with attempting to quantify the cost of the community health that we desire, so that when we don't name that the deficit in our housing access, accessible or affordable or otherwise, is at the tune of approximately 2.5 billion a year over the next 15 years, we can get lulled into a coma when we hear people say, well, I put 50 million in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And then you can say, well, dude, that is fantastic. Thank you for satisficing me. But it's actually 2.5 billion for the year. So you got a little bit more work to go do, but good job on the 50 million. And oftentimes our communities are not equipped to be able to land that type of jugular punch on really the magnitude of the issue. So you can stop looking at me for praise for the incremental gains when we've been talking about the deficits since what appears to be, let Paul tell it, the dawn of time, or since we stole and blood soaked this land. Ephraim?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'd also, I'm just blown away about all the topics that we've been talking about. I'm super happy to be a part of this conversation. I'll preface what I have to say, that I am a realtor in South Minneapolis, based out of Powderhorn for the last 20 or so years, maybe 19. So I have been very steeped in helping people create a foundation for themselves and their families. I think Samuel is one of the people I've helped on this call. So I will say that it is not streamlined at all. I mean, shedding light, have people seen the Mapping Prejudice website that the U of M made? That just also just spells it out and gives a really good visual of like where this has come from as far as housing goes, and you know how it's steeped in all these inequities. Just yesterday, I was trying to help somebody figure out how to repair their credit in order to start the process to even think about buying a home. And then all of the different programs that are available are not like front and center. It's a lot more work. So a lot of professionals, most of them white, are not going to do the outreach to help people. But now that it is being seen as one of the biggest markets that can be so-called tapped, more people hopefully will pay more attention to these things. I think the resources is out there, but it just feels like fits and starts to get people, including myself, like up to speed on stuff like that, even though I very actively try every day. To Dan's points, I think they're really great points. I do feel like we are starting to see some redefinition of what a family matters on the legislature level. I've helped groups of people buy property together who were unrelated, not blood relatives, and so that's promising. Some of the crowdfunding stuff that I'd like to see get more legs and more momentum. Some of the TOPA stuff that's been passed, and like people actually being able to buy their own apartment buildings is pretty phenomenal. But yeah, it's interesting to see the starts of these conversations happening. I think when I think about like capitalism, other different models, to break it down to it can be so confusing, but what I've heard and what I believe is health is wealth and knowledge is power. All these kind of sayings are very true. And if we can focus on those things, I believe other stuff will follow. But I mean, number one is getting people showered and people housing and, you know, the basic human right type stuff. And it is like, you know, we are hobbled. A lot of people are hobbled, and it does seem like an uphill battle, but I do see that it is possible. And I know that was a lot of stuff. That satisficing thing, I'm going to run with that one. That is, I never heard that before. It feels like that's just pervasive in our communities. And well, thank you for letting me have some air.
Always, always. Thank you so much. Again, all of these comments are so welcomed. And again, this is the point of it, because it's our collective voices, your collective voice that matters most. And again, it's not because we have all the answers. And I think Mary Margaret on day one acknowledged that we know that there are different people and groups that are not at the table. This is not the end of the work in terms of how we begin to work together to try to move the needle, maybe shift the paradigm, center wellness over wealth, but not because the system in wealth cannot be used to support well-being, right? So this isn't me saying, let's blow it all up and start from scratch. No, it's me saying that that might be what it takes, and you might actually have my vote if you have a really good plan on how we do that. But I think it's about acknowledging that the things that we want for ourselves and each other and community will look like probably a different configuration of resources in different places in order for that well-being and that wellness to take hold and to seem pervasive and accessible for people in our community. The one last thing that I will share before I'm going to turn it back over to Paul to launch us into our hope segment is that I oftentimes tell myself, you know, my belief system is on the right track when I do an exercise where I imagine if I started the world, and when I say the world, not from a God perspective, but if I were to design society from the beginning, what would I focus on? So that kind of pulls me out of what is. If I just allow myself to think about what would I do from the beginning? And it always starts with, well, we got to house people, we got to feed people, we have to be well. No time have I done that exercise have I thought about, man, I am going to find the top 10% in the world and I'm going to make sure that they get 80% of the resources. I've never done that. And that's how you know that we are currently misaligned, is if you do your own little exercise, you would never put 10% of the people on top of the rest of the world and give them 80% of the assets. You would generally start with something a little bit more humble, more modest in scope, is how do we eat? Where and are we going to take shelter? And that's kind of the mix that's off. All right, Brother Paul, take us to chat.
I just wanted to say,
Tabatha.
I wanted to share that
Sorry, Christina, go.
Kara Carlson wasn't feeling well and needed to sign off of Zoom. So she just sent me a message saying that, and that she felt the meeting tonight that she posted about was very much about the things Paul was talking about. So just wanted to point that out and give her thanks and goodbye on her behalf. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. And I hopefully I didn't offend anyone. I truly meant the secular church of this convening. So, but Paul, take it away.
Okay. So I'm gonna do two things for hope this time, but there are more actual things that are going on. Hope. The other ones, you know, Tuesday were bigger processes. Okay. So Shanae, this is for you because I took to heart looking for the brilliant young people, and so this is a project in Richmond, California. Richmond, California is right across the bay from San Francisco. It's actually the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. Its history is of a city that had a big shipbuilding industry and a large petrochemical industry. during World War II. Lots of people came to Richmond to work in the shipbuilding industry, lots of African Americans and immigrants. It had an incredibly segregated housing stock because, as we talked, the government built housing for the workers and they segregated it. So it early on started out with this, population. It's also a story that we know a lot of communities that are really dependent on like one big industry. So shipbuilding started to decline and fall apart, loss of jobs, and the things that come with that deterioration of the family unit, schools, higher violence, like all the things that we know. But this story is about young people coming together to start the RISE Center, RYSE Center. And it's a youth center that was developed in Richmond. It started with about a dozen young people and an adult leader talking about how do we create a safe and healing place in our community for young people? And what does that look like? And how do we get it done? That's where it started. Young people got together and talked about their everyday struggles, trauma, whether it's going to an underperforming school, food insecurity, dehumanizing police, immigration, roundups, violence, homelessness. Like this is real, right? This is, it's not TV, doesn't end up great, at the end of 30 minutes. This is real. So can we create a safe space to do that? So what they did is they came together, they figured out the program, they co-designed what it should look like. And in that process, they engaged over 200 young people in Richmond. Once they got the vision done, young people, interns were paid to take it out, and they spent the next year and a half sharing the vision with government and philanthropy and all these folks, because they needed to get the capital to actually build this place. The final design included a theater, outdoor play spaces, an art studio, media lab, a garden, teaching kitchen, mental health counseling and a health clinic, a maker space, and a pop-up small business incubator. And something that they also demanded was a restorative justice space where they partnered with the county district attorney, to work on restorative justice with young people. So this is actually a built place. You can look it up on their website. And the final design and programming concepts won the Fast Company 2019 World Changing Ideas Award. So the reason to me this was exciting because it was really about what we were talking about. One, it's about how community can drive change. It's about co-creation. It's about young people. It's about centering the voices and the knowledge, of the people who are most effective to make change in their community, right? And so I really align with this. Personally, I've spent a lot of time working with young people in North Minneapolis from my days volunteering at North High, mentoring. But I thought this was really a great story about how you can make this change. And it wasn't about some organization coming and saying, we need to do this. And so we're going to have 5 meetings with you, and then we're going to go out and raise the money, and then we're going to figure it out. It was no, it was about, nope. We know our community best. We're going to fix it. And along the way, it's about young people too. Like, okay, getting in the room with government officials and people in foundations and talking to them directly, and having probably saying some of those things, Tabatha, that you said about getting to the jugular about why do we need to do this, and being able to raise this money and be part of the design process and ultimately create this space, which has had a major impact in their community when they're looking at violence, all kinds of when we want to start looking at outcomes. So that's one that I think, from a whole perspective is great because, it really shows how you can do this. The other one is something that's right here at home. It's North Commons Park. It's in North Minneapolis. And that's from two perspectives. One is, North Commons is one of the oldest parks in the Minneapolis Park Board system. It's 26 acres. It's in the heart, and the YMCA is across the street, North High is across the street, but it's also in a space or in between spaces that have experienced, some high trauma, whether it's unrest in the 60s on Plymouth Avenue and West Broadway, whether it's the killing of Jamar Clark, whether it's the recent unrest that we've had. So North Commons is in this landscape that's experienced a lot of trauma. It's also beloved, by the community. Decades of people have come to North Commons. So the park board is looking at a redevelopment of North Commons as part of their master plan. A lot of the work that's gone into North Commons has been driven by a community collective called Seeds to Harvest. But recently, the park board put out an RFQ to solicit design teams to do the work. Okay, why this is hope? Because I was part of the selection process, but I've never been on a selection process where there were 5 African-American owned architecture firms as part of the process. So we were actually in the majority as part of the process and not in the minority, all right? And so for those of us who are in the architecture profession and know that 2% of licensed architects in the country are African-American, it was huge. Also in the room were two, is Alicia still on the call? Oh, she's gone. So, but is she still here? Yep. So Alicia and Damaris were on the call. Black women who are licensed architects, which is even a worse stat in our profession. And for me, there were people part of these teams who I've known since high school. So Jamil Ford, Lissa Washington, James Garrett. So there was power in the fact that all these people, but then even better, we selected a team led by a Black architect. Not we had a process and it was, oh, that was nice, we had all these people, but we still selected, the majority firm. We selected Fihan to do the work. And for me, it was just okay, incredible. Because we don't do that. This doesn't happen, right? And it doesn't happen at this scale. I don't know, so I haven't done any research, but my bet is the park board has never hired a minority firm to do a project of this scale, size, scope, and budget. That would be my bet. I'd have to dig a little bit, but I don't think I'm wrong. The excitement about that too is that now we'll be able to, the lived experience that's going to come to thinking about what happens there is going to be totally different than it would be, from a typical process. So, my wife knows that there are days where I'll be complaining about these processes all the time. However, this is a point where I was like, okay, this worked. And, we were able to, have a process that, centered equity, even in making sure that everybody got in the room to have that experience and that connection, that if you haven't ever interviewed with the park board, just them getting to see you is really important, because that's how you build relationships. So those are my two stories of hope. Try to end it on a lighter note than, the history part, but that's where I'm at today.
Thank you, Paul. We will, I didn't even make comment cards, so you won't get the feedback about how aggressive your history has been. We do want to hear from you. I joke, but I'm really going to quickly turn it over to all of you. And the question is really, is there a project, a person, or an initiative that is giving you hope within the space of design or community building that is centering people and people's well-being or our environment's well-being. So Paul certainly, I think, did a great job of lifting up a couple that certainly I immediately went to the good old Google to learn a little bit more about in real time, but just wanting to give people an opportunity and invite and encourage other sharing around things that are happening to help move the needle, even if that sometimes feels like it's hard to register. So I see in the chat, Ephraim is lifting up the Center for Performing Arts. Ephraim, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, or that could be enough. People are also invited to drop more initiatives, the name of a person or anything you want in the chat.
I'll just say quickly that I had the pleasure of meeting with Jackie, the director over there, a couple weeks ago, and it is a grassroots scenario where she led a capital campaign, but it wasn't super difficult what happened. I mean, she financed about 5 million, but had to kind of back it up with programming and whatnot. But it is for the community, creative based. Yeah, it's an amazing project. It made me feel like there's hope that I can do something similar.
Excellent. Same thing to you, Shanae. I see that you dropped in Youth Undoing Institutional Racism, Twin Cities. So a program of AFSC, if you want to, if you're able to come off mute and share a little bit more about that or how people can get connected or support.
Yes, you know, I'm gonna do a shameless plug. I'm gonna put it out there.
It has to be shameless. It has to be shameless. If I had some background music, I would start playing it to tee you up.
No, y'all, I love young people. So everything is always going to relate back to the young people. Just a FYI, if you've never been in a meeting with me before. And so I run this program. It's called the Healing Justice Program. We disrupt the cradle to prison pipeline. And we have some amazing young people that we have gathered. Last night, we had an amazing event to talk about the legacy of MLK and the legacy of integration. Does it still work? We had up to 25 amazing young people on the call to talk about this, given the rise of racial incidents in schools. And so I'm super excited about the work. We've been working with Commissioner Fernando. We've been working with Corcoran Neighborhood. We're working with Bryan and Central Neighborhood to really talk about the issues that impact youth and how we intentionally or unintentionally have filtered young people into this cradle to prison pipeline by not providing resources, by not lifting up their voices in all the spaces, by constantly diminishing their value. And so I'm excited about the work and the potential. And although we are a small program, we are mighty. The young people are coming for y'all next. And I'm excited. So let's get it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shanae. Anyone else want to name, lift up a program, an initiative, a process, or a person that is giving you hope when it comes to how design and or community is being thought of more with a people first lens, and that really focuses on our community well-being and not necessarily maybe the aspects of transactional capitalism? Let's see. Oh, Leisha.
Yeah, I just put something in the chat. I think Seward Redesign is really doing a wonderful job of trying to center people of color as part of their design process. Taylor Cooper, I'm going to mess up her last name, but I'm going to try to say it, Shmira Kavanagh. She is the project manager of both of these projects and really trying to do things differently and being very intentional about helping businesses of color and wealth building of small businesses. And so, yeah, I just think she's doing a phenomenal job of making sure that we're doing development differently and trying to and bring the people that are along with her, bring them alongside her as well.
Wonderful. We had the benefit of Taylor's good company on Tuesday. Hopefully she'll maybe be able to join us on Monday as well. So we definitely agree with that sentiment about not only her work specifically, but the organization in total. Also, I see that Ephraim dropped in new rules in Juxta. Always a good opportunity to give them a shout out related to the work that they're doing. Ephraim, I'll give you an opportunity if you wanted to make a note or two about either one of those organizations.
No, I just feel like I just want to shout out.
Okay, excellent. So listen, we are going to kind of transition because again, we are in the home stretch for today 2 of our History Hurdles and Hope workshop series. And really the next part is just for me to kind of do what I can to synthesize what I think some of the key themes were that were brought to the table again today. And I won't completely do it justice, I know. That's why we have the recording, and we'll make sure that everybody gets access to the recording for you to review it and at your leisure and or share it with other people in your network. But one of the things that we did today was after Mary Margaret's wonderful recap of day 1, is we started with centering this idea that we hope will really be, I think, the premise for a broader hope conversation on Monday. But this construct of satisficing and this idea, and Mary Margaret did a great job of dropping kind of a better definition into the chat, but how we often settle, if you will, as opposed to looking for more optimal outcomes because of the time that it takes, or maybe the other additional resources that are needed to bring about an outcome that takes us from being just satisfied and participating in the act of satisfaction, just to move the needle on a project, to more what we might consider to be people-centered well-being outcomes that really might require that we acknowledge that the systems and the tools are not currently present deep enough in our community to bring it to bear, which will require additional work on our part. So kind of in the spirit of that construct, we moved a little bit into this idea of 21st century development and rubrics and ways of thinking about what's present in 21st century development and dare I say 21st century design as a way or as a framework to think about what do we ultimately aspire to, which I think what I took away from that is it's not just about the building, but it's about the people and the environment that drives what should be built, right? And how we build and when we build, and not because it's a part of someone's wealth portfolio. And so that's kind of how we led the day. And then Paul, again, took us to the woodshed with our history, just helping us to think deeply and reflecting on, from a specifically a housing perspective, how I wrote down the line, Paul, but basically you at some point said FHA's mantra was housing only for white people. And then you was like, period. Like you didn't have nothing else to say.
Because that's the truth. Just the jugular, Tabatha, you know.
It was. I don't know if I was completely ready for it. But yes, and just really landing the point that the government has certainly had a history and has demonstrated that it's very much interested. Sometimes they've taken a class side, they've taken a cultural side, and that you can see that in different policies. And that also really helps us to grapple with, in part, why sometimes the numbers that we recount around the disparities between who are homeowners in this country seems to continue to be eluding us in terms of how is it that we're not making progress. And I think the history today would just kind of point to, because it has been so well engineered for such a long time that it will take a lot of unraveling, right, in order for us to begin to see the progress that I think that everyone on this call is imagining in some form or fashion. And then hurdles, just continuing this idea of how institutions play a role in the hurdles that we experience. And one of the things that a little bit new from a hyper local perspective is just what we bring to the table in terms of things that we kind of believe in, ideas that we have yet to challenge, constructs that we have yet to kind of say, yep, that actually doesn't work for the community. And one that we spent a little bit of time on is the idea of how do we really get our arms around whether or not home ownership, right, from a more modern capitalistic structure is really what communities, all communities, and communities that experience a fair amount of disparity are actually wanting or calling for. So then we kind of got to hope. And I think Paul did a great job of teeing up a couple of examples and really leaning into the conversation that we had on Tuesday, and calling out a couple of examples where not only young people, right, with the Rise Center, whose voice and perspectives led, after I took a quick glance at the website, over a 10-year process, a decade, to be able to have their vision to take hold in the community, but then also mentioned North Commons and the win that was the identification of a Black-led architectural firm to be able to be a part of that reimagining there. And then we took a little time together to name other projects, people, or initiatives that are inspiring us to think that, yes, that first poll that we took about our confidence level, about whether or not in our lifetime we will begin to see 21st century development and design to take hold or to advance, ultimately we were more confident than not. And I think that that is in a good place to be, even acknowledging that there is a lot more work to do. So that's kind of the themes that I took away from our workshop today. And again, opening it up for what else kind of landed on people. Was there another theme that you really think that kind of was discussed or lifted up that we should make sure that gets kind of captured in some of our notes? Because we're going to be sharing back information in a couple of different ways. The recordings, as I mentioned, I know Angie and Christina have been playing different roles. I think Sherry as well in terms of note taking. So we will provide access to that, so that, again, some of the websites or people's names that have been mentioned, when you have a little bit more leisure, you can kind of look into a little bit more deeply if you have interest. So any other thoughts on themes?
I had one.
Go for it, go for it.
So earlier we saw a matrix that sort of progressed a development project towards what is being called regenerative development. And I think there's a lot to draw from that concept. And we, in some ways, only touched on the surface level of it, because as I understand it, regenerative development is something that would really apply well on a corridor like Lake Street that has experienced multiple traumas and that has a lot of suffering. And there's something restorative about the regenerative development approach, which gets beyond just equitable development or sustainable development. So yes, lift up natural systems, renewable energy, racial justice, white superiority, as concepts to consider while we're making all these decisions. But there's another level to regenerative development that I think is healing. And it's worth us thinking about. And I think a lot of the examples that have been mentioned in the last two sessions have elements of it. We just didn't tease them out specifically in terms of how a community heals and how a community prospers.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you so much.
Tabatha, do you mind if I jump in for just a second on that?
Of course, of course.
Thank you so much, Russ. That's such a tremendous insight. I had made a note, and it relates directly to what you were saying, that when we were working with the youth apprentices at Juxta in taking this very complex, very technical matrix and having them take it in and then reflect it back to us and how they understood the concepts, there was a palpable energy and excitement among these high school students about regenerative systems in their neighborhood in North Minneapolis. And I think it relates very much to what you said, that in places that have experienced trauma, youth resonate with the idea of a self-sustaining neighborhood and community where they can grow their own food, create their own energy, take care of themselves, nurture themselves, heal, and then, after taking what they need, share it out, further with more neighbors, right? So I think there's just a lot of power in the youth vision and embracing of that, and that healing nature that you were speaking to. The one other thing I want to throw out while I'm live here, the idea of the market won't support it, right? That phrase is used so often to tamp down greater aspirations. And so much of what we've talked today does come back to the nature of capitalism in America has never been pure capitalism. It's always been shifted and shaped by the government in various ways over time. All of the programs that Paul has named are shifting market forces. So if we say the market won't support it, that's a red herring. The market supports a whole lot of things happening when it is shaped to do so and incentivized to do so. So I think we can take a lot of, we can identify both hurdles and places of hope in unexpected places, in programs that haven't actually been supporting equitable regenerative outcomes, but if turned on their head or used in different ways or toward different aims, those same tools could send us in the direction we need to go, just shaping the market differently.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I gotta say, I think that Russ also touched on that in our Tuesday session. This idea that, you know, even, and I think you put it in the chat, Russ, just about like the history and the different challenges about what is being taught and what is not being taught. And there's just something to say, there is a degree of resistance and because of all the isms that are in our country, and it's not an indictment or being angry about isms, but that puts people in a defensive posture to actually acknowledge how things work, right? Because it is easier to say that the market won't support it as opposed to deal with the fact that typically nothing in life works from a theoretical perspective, right? Like, so you can write a document and it never then, because once life gets on it and takes hold, it never works as it was written in a textbook, right? And so it is hard for people to receive and accept that there has been a lot of machinations, a lot of engineering that has been done on our capitalistic environment in service and in favor of a particular class and a particular cultural group. And that makes people uneasy because they think it's all about, oh, I can't own that. And, you know, so there's things that even in our work, our collective work of imagining how do we help to create maybe not only a mantra, but action that really lifts up, hey, equitable and well-being and healthy communities is a right. Getting people comfortable with the actual history and the truth of some of the things that we've been reminded of today with Paul's excellent facilitation and guidance. So Louis, I see your hand is raised.
Oop, there's a mute button. All right, so just kind of processing through a lot of the things that have been said here today. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, well, first off, sort of to your point, Tabatha, you know, no, the best laid plans don't survive contact with the enemy. This is just the reality of our world. And at the risk of leaning too hard into Satisficing, while I love the regenerative development, all the sort of like the questions that have been asked there, sort of like the guiding light that it's providing for people, I think that like we need to be able to both advocate and push for these things while not enforcing it, because the moment it becomes, well, this is now required, then that's when, you know, like everyone who doesn't want to do that stuff for one reason or another is going to push back that much harder, right? So like, I mean, even if so I'm thinking, so for example, I know the redevelopment of the U.S. Bank building is that was called out as a piece of hope, right? And I know that there were also a number of different developers that were looking at that sort of a thing. So it's, people really like metrics and numbers, and I feel like this platform of the regenerative that the platform that we've written, or that you've written here, or sort of started us off as, could make for a really great, like the start of a rubric, right? Of like, here are different items that we can score on. And then based on those scores, you end up with kind of like an aggregate of like, you know, just an understanding of like, here are the choices that this particular design has made, that this set of architecture has made, that then also provides some transparency, as well as kind of like a ladder up and into some things that maybe aren't super clear for people who either don't have time or don't understand enough to be able to really get into the deep thick of what the proposal is doing. And then sort of, you know, the more of that kind of thing that we have, the closer we can get into this kind of furthering that whole mission, right? Because in the end, decisions are going to be, or sorry, choices are going to be made. And some of those choices are going to be, how much money do we have for this versus how, you know, how nice do we want it to be, and how equitable are we willing to be on it? And a lot of times, you know, it's going to be like elected leaders are going to be making those choices. And when we make transparent that they are making the choice to go with the cheaper option versus the equitable option, then we can start to hold them to account. On the other side of it, then they're going to look at that and they're going to think, if I vote for the cheap option instead of the equitable option, people are going to hold me accountable. Maybe I need to lean a little bit further into the equity thing, because then I can show that I'm committed to this as one of our values. Just sort of a thought.
Excellent. There's a lot there, and I want to get to Dan and Richard, but acknowledge that there was a resource that Russ dropped in the chat that gets at a little bit of what you were saying, Louis, in terms of the equitable development scorecard that a variety of community partners built. And the only thing that I would name in that regard is it's currently not necessarily our city's policy to necessarily have to use it. And so there's just opportunities in terms of how do we build consistency in the system, so that when things, for instance, come before the Planning Commission, that they actually have the score in front of them, as opposed to the 16-page staff report that basically green lights the project because it, from an ordinance perspective, they see themselves as a quasi judicial body that is just focused on, hey, if it's legal, we're going to green light this project, and don't necessarily have the lens to say, well, how many projects of this nature that don't necessarily skew toward equity are we green lighting and approving as a commission?
Absolutely.
So just work to do on a couple of different fronts, but I'm going to ask Dan to go and then Richard. So Richard, I see your hand. Thank you.
I'll try and keep this brief, but I was thinking about a lot of the things that have come up today, whether it's the structure of like FHA or even the 21st century design matrix, and then about how so much of it are these interwoven kind of policy decisions or economic structures that are really opaque. And I keep thinking about access and understanding of those structures, and how frequently that opacity is kept as a barrier, you know, that it's designed so it's not easily understandable, you know. And Ephraim, I don't want to pick on you, but like realty and buying a house, like what an absurd process that entire thing is. It's like there is literally like so many gates that need to be opened by different people, and every single one has to be gone through. And it's like the first time you do it, you're like, oh my God, I had no idea I had to do this. Like the structures themselves, I feel like need to become more transparent, or I don't know, more education is always a challenge. But and then I think about making that stuff accessible, and how you saw the excitement of youth, especially when they started to put the terms of 21st century design in their own framework, right? That all of a sudden creates a power, or a sense of power, where it's like, okay, now I understand what this is. Now I can move with it. Now I can work with this. And I feel like there's an opportunity to try and identify, you know, in development and in, I don't know, whether it's city structure or where they lie, but the structures that are truly opaque, that are not fundamentally understood by most people, so that we can increase the level of engagement, or, you know, sense of ability to engage in it. so that, you know, so that people feel like they have power. Because, you know, still, I mean, tax code, right? Another one of those things where it still serves a certain segment of the population because they can afford to hire somebody that understands that stuff, right? Meanwhile, the rest of us are like, I don't know, right? It's that fundamental understanding and access to it that I think are really important. It also ties with it, like it goes in with untying all the knots, right? Seeing all the relationships between things that might be prohibitive.
Yep.
That was much longer than I anticipated it would be, sorry.
Dan, this is a safe space, okay? We're just taking our point from our lead, Paul, who is, you know, not the most brief. I'm teasing. Richard, you're up next.
Hot from the kettle black.
Put it in the chat. Don't come for me, Paul.
Well, now the pressure's on as you pass the baton. Man, I better be brief. I guess I'm speaking to kind of Louis and Russ's point about the kind of the powerful of the regenerative kind of centering life conversation. And I think that's really important to kind of consider as you think about the transformations of development, if you will. And the danger is kind of going straight to a matrix or a checklist or something like that. Because where you have to start, I really feel, is in that initial statement of, you know, whatever you want to call it, development strives to provide a healthy environment for all people and living systems now and in the future. So there, like before anything else happens, there needs to be kind of a collective community conversation about what does a vibrant future look like for all of us where we're thriving. And then how do you then, once you've had that conversation, then you can go to the matrix conversation of how do you then set goals for stuff, buildings, whatever. Also, you know, this always crashes against the economic system. We can't afford to do this. It's more expensive to do that. And we forget that the economic system is basically a value system we create that is supposed to be supportive of the creation of a thriving environment. We flip the whole thing and say we're all supposed to be supporting this abstract economic value system that's our own creation. So, you know, hopefully, you know, this beginning conversation flips that and says, you know, how does that then, all these things then become supportive of this vision? And that's where it needs to start, because the danger is you know, the danger in starting with a matrix checklist or whatever is those are dissection tools, and dissection tools are ripe for destroying your momentum and killing off life and dividing and conquering it and not letting you do what you want to do. And also, you know, I've seen it with community groups. A dissection tool like a matrix is a good way to not really authentically have the conversations. You push it off as a disconnected, objective thing that's safe to talk about it as some separate thing, instead of really really making it personal and getting on to some of the real conversation. So the order of doing things and really centering that kind of living life, thriving conversation first and having it guide everything, I think is critical. So, and that was long-winded too. So now I'll take it all in terms of like, don't do that.
that was great, Richard. There's really no wrong way. And what I would lift up a little bit is that, and what makes that additionally, there's opportunity, and I want to say, I guess maybe a challenge for us in our work, in our collective work as we continue, is that sometimes we are predisposed to still try to create equity by reconfiguring who has the thing that still may not be the healthiest in our community. So you will even hear it in our conversations in terms of wanting to increase BIPOC ownership, wanting to change the power dynamic. And even in some of that phrasing, this is, again, we're trying to challenge, are those truly the paradigms that we hold as what will bring about health? That's not, you said a lot, Richard, but not because it was a lot of words, but because that's hard to do, what you just described, often because of how we often are thinking about trying to right the ship is about changing who has what, like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, when really part of the problem is all the things in the world that no matter how we arrange the deck chairs, we have to decide we are going to navigate them together, right?
Yeah.
So it's not about moving them down to stewage and just saying, you guys hope for the best because there's no lifeboats down there. It's just a lot that you said there. That's great. So anyway, we are 5 minutes out. And generally what we have said is that we try to provide a little bit of context for our next day, which is Monday. And again, it will be, as a reminder, the 12 to 2:30 session for those who are able to make it. Such deep appreciation for everyone who has carved out what I think is a significant amount of time in your day to be participating in these conversations. I want to acknowledge that this is not a small thing. So thank you. So I'm going to ask Paul if you want to just kind of outline a little bit of where we are heading on Monday, but in truth, that is still a work in progress between the planning team, just because we really wanted to take the time to understand how Tuesday and today went. So Paul, is there anything that's coming up for you that you would point to that you definitely know that you're going to want to touch on for Monday?
So yes, it's a work in progress, but I think that the discussion we've had about regenerative and the process, and I think Richard, you did a really good job of talking about where to start and that. And so I'm hoping we'll talk more about how we get to regenerative, but also how do we do that? And Tabatha, your connection to all of the other things around it, what's that impact? So, because Richard gave the best description for me about why I don't like checklists, so I'm going to use that. So I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have about what that looks like and how we're going to take in what we heard and apply that to Monday.
Excellent. Okay, so that really pretty much brings us to the end. We are 3 minutes out. Unless there are any last minute questions, logistics or otherwise, I believe that you all should have the meeting link for Monday's session on your calendar that I believe Christina was able to send out. If not, you can drop Christina a note or me a note by email and we'll make sure that you have it. But otherwise, again, deep appreciation for your time and your energy and your participation, your full engagement and attention. We are deeply grateful for your support as we navigate this first workshop series. With that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all.